Hey y'all, my name is Leslie Hooker, and this debate is on the use of restraints and seclusions for those with autism and other exceptionalities.
Hi, I'm Mindy Ditzler.
All right, and I am Christian Porter. So I will go ahead and get us started today. The first, well, the way we have our discussion structured is I will take some time to go over the technicalities of the use of restraints and seclusions, going over definitions and some of the legal aspects that we as behavior analysts need to be aware of. From there, we're going to shift over and we're going to be talking about the pros of using restraint and seclusion. And then we'll jump into the cons and have a little bit of discussion there. And then we have some ethical questions that we will be discussing as a group. So to get us started with the definitions of restraint, a lot of different organizations use different definitions. Most of them are all pretty similar. The ones that we are going to be using for the purpose of our project, we're pulling from the Association for Behavior Analysis International, as well as the U.S. Department of Education, since those are ones that are going to be impacting us the most. Restraints, according to the association, is physically holding or securing the individual either for a brief period of time to interrupt and intervene in severe behavioral problems, or for an extended period of time using mechanical devices to prevent otherwise uncontrollable problem behaviors that has the potential to produce serious injury. The U.S. Department of Education splits the definition to specifically for physical restraints and for mechanical restraints. The physical restraints they define as a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move his or her torso, arms, legs, or head freely. And then the mechanical restraints is the use of any device or equipment to restrict a student's freedom of movement. So they're very, very similar. The big key factor that both of them are focusing on is that it impedes their movement or ability to move around. Seclusion, the definition from these two organizations is pretty much the same. The association defines it as seclusion. Seclusion involves isolating an individual from others to interrupt and intervene with behavioral problems that places the individual or others at harm or risk. And then the Department of Education defines it as the involuntary confinement of the student alone in a room or area from which the student is physically prevented from leaving. That could be with guards or locks or whatever you want to to use for that physical barrier. So those are the definitions that we will be using as kind of our premise for this project. Is that isolation or seclusion is basically isolation where they're prevented from leaving, and restraint is anything, be it mechanical or physical, that impedes the ability to move. Regarding the ethics code, or the professional and ethical compliance code, the main sections of that document that relate to restraint and seclusion is subsection 4.08 through 4.09. And 4.08 is mostly referring to the use of punishment. Physical restraints and mechanical restraints and seclusion should never be used as a form of punishment. And the idea is that we focus mostly on reinforcement procedures before we ever consider use of restraints. And then 4.09 is the main one, which states behavior analysts review and appraise the restrictiveness of procedures and always recommend the least restrictive procedures likely to be effective. So if in a situation we are getting to the point where we're considering using restraints or seclusion, we have already exhausted pretty much every other option available to us. Regarding legal definitions or legal laws that impact the use of restriction or of restraint or seclusion, it varies a lot from state to state. The definition remains pretty much the same for all of them, but the way it's worded leaves itself open to a lot of interpretation. For more information on the nitty-gritty details, I'll refer you to a document that I'm about to pull up right here. There are two of them. These were produced by Jessica Butler, who is the congressional liaison for autism right now. She's done a lot of research on the current laws around seclusion and restraint. And she's produced a couple of documents. One of them is My State Seclusion and Restraint Laws, in which it outlines each state's current standing and what, as of 2013, what the current work was being done to alter those laws. The other document that I want to refer you to, How Safe is the Schoolhouse, which is another document she used for it. Again, goes into a lot of the in-depth laws regarding seclusion and restraint, though this one is focused much more on an educational setting. So that's, again, I will refer you to those documents for the nitty-gritty details. But for the sake of our discussion, there are about we need to really emphasize. The first one is that mechanical restraints should never be used, at least in the educational system and as current laws state. Mechanical restraints are just not allowed, period. The second one is that we need to be aware that policies are not universal. So we need to be aware of the specific laws for our unique states that we're working in. We also need to be aware that whatever policies are put in place should not affect those with special needs only. Whatever school policies or company policies are put in effect apply to everyone equally. The third one is that restraint should never harm. So it should never restrict the ability to breathe. It should never cause injury. The fourth point is that restraints are not punishment. They should never be used for disciplinary purposes. And then 5, 6, and 7 kind of get lumped together. Staff should be trained frequently and regularly, as well as the treatment protocols and the rationale for using it should be reviewed frequently, especially as the client's behavior changes. And then we should be documenting everything, and anytime the restraint or seclusion is used, the parent should be informed immediately. Yeah, so those are kind of the nitty-gritty legalities and procedural things that need to be aware of when using restraint or seclusion.
Okay, so I'm just going to show a safe procedure. This is from a specific organization. It's called Safety Care. They're an applied behavioral analysis group that decided to take your restraint modules that each of the states use. Like here in where I live, it's called CPI, and that's just one of the restraints that they use. It follows the ethical codes, and it's just a little bit more safe than some of the other things. But also to point out with that, as Christian said, it is the last resort. Like, that is not something you go to right away. It's what you go to when the person is self-harming themselves or is going to harm somebody else, like all of those definitions stated. So just keep that in mind, that it is not the first thing you jump to. It is your last resort, which is what I've learned through the training I've been given through safety care and CPI. It is your last resort. So, along with that, sometimes the last resort does become the first resort. I have had kids that it is an immediate need to restrain them, but that's because they're banging their head on the wall, they're biting themselves. That's when the last resort does become the first resort. But that's why you need to know the definitions and you need to know all this training, so you know when to use it and when it is needed and how to ethically go about the situation. So I'm going to be getting into the pros on why we should be using restraints and seclusion, and when they're necessary. Most of the stuff I found was more leaning towards restraint. There aren't a lot of places that use seclusion anymore, that I have found research on. This, as we'll get into later, the research is very blurred. Some of the articles I have are pro and con articles. So the first article I had is the International Association, the ABA. They had put out the statement on seclusion and restraint, which is one of the definitions that Christian gave. And they basically, the biggest thing that they said was it should be used when the person is no longer safe. And like I said before, that's biting, that's hitting their head, that can be charging at somebody else. Anything that could put them or someone else in a medical situation automatically warrants that something needs to be done for the safety of all involved. So that was their biggest statement. They pushed for it, saying that if you had medical proof that you needed to have physical restraints or seclusion, you needed to have it documented. Like, it needs to be somewhere in your medical history, in the school system. If you have a behavior intervention plan, it needs to be in there. And personally, as someone who does work in the school district, where I am, restraints and seclusion must be in the BIP for you to perform them. So if you have kids who have a BIP, they tend to be your more self-injurious children. And so it is in the BIP that it says step by step what you're going to be doing if that child shows those behaviors. So that's basically what they said, that when it's medically necessary for the child to have restraints or seclusion, it should be used. The next was a research study that talked about the use of physical restraints for self-injurious behavior specifically, and how it should be turned into positive reinforcement. I think it is that it needs to be known that it should never be used negatively, and it should not be used for punishment. It should not be viewed as punishment. It should be viewed as something that is for the safety of others. And that's really what this article had pointed out, that when we are using restraints, it should be done in a positive way. And if you have ABA training, and you are a behavior analyst, you know how to use that positive reinforcement within the use of restraints. And so this case study basically said they had a bunch of participants, and who did self-injurious behaviors. Like one participant was bit themselves, somebody else hit their head a lot, and they just used some positive reinforcement before the behavior started, and it slowly decreased the behaviors, where they ended up not needing the restraints as much for the behaviors, but they were still needed. And they also specifically said that if you're going to be using restraints on your clients or your students or whoever you're working with, that there should be some documentation on why they need it. and they themselves said in the article that it really should only be done for children who are injuring themselves or others. It shouldn't be done until that moment starts. So that was their article. And then the next one, which was kind of interesting, was it kind of just discussed the social acceptability of restraints within like the community and how people view it and how it should be viewed and if it is effective or not. And they just specifically once again said that there are cases that restraint should be used and there does need to be documentation on that. They did say that it was for more of your self-injurious friends, and they, from what they gathered, the treatments were effective. It didn't say if they were using, if the people in the research study were using what we are all calling ethical restraints, but they did say that that the treatments that they used were effective, and their final statement was that if you're going to use them, then you need to determine what behaviors that you think need restraints, and so to do that, you should use the ethics code and then just your kind of what I call your gut feeling on what those behaviors look like. And for me personally, I kind of agree that they should be just self-injurious behaviors, or when someone is harming you, like scratching you, biting you, any of those dangerous, quote unquote, behaviors is when restraint should be used, and seclusion if necessary. I have seen seclusion work on clients who are highly motivated by attention, and the only way to get them to stop beating themselves is if they don't have any attention, and the only way to do that is to seclude them. But we're talking about a seclusion where they're in a room within, like this was specifically in a classroom, they're in a room within a classroom, so you're still there to protect them if they are not going to stop. But that's all I had about the pros, and as you'll see, they're going to blur a little with the cons, and we'll discuss that later after we get into the cons.
All right, I am going to talk about the cons. First, I'd like to touch on the ABAI statement, as both Christian and Leslie did. Principle of least restrictiveness. Restraints and seclusion should only be used in cases of emergency as harm to self or others. Also, if restraints and seclusion are going to be used within a behavior plan or safety plan, there needs to be consent by parents or whoever the responsible party is, and that is emphasized. So their stance is really avoid at all costs unless it's an emergency or really needs to be put into the safety plan. Next, I read an article about the frequency of the use of physical interventions and frequency of use. In this article, it was found that the subjects to physical intervention were more likely to be young males with a high probability of being on the autism spectrum, which I found this to be a little upsetting, but it seems to be true. Physical interventions in this article included anything from restraint, seclusion, PRN medications, and protective devices. So that could be a helmet or whatever for headbanging or things like that. Also in this study, it was found that PRN medications and seclusion were used in combination with physical restraint than with those with autism. So that just proves the amount of restraints that are being done, and more so with autistic individuals. The article that I found was It talked about the use of restraints and seclusion causing physical and emotional harm. The United States Government Accountability Office, the GAO, found that most restraints and seclusion involve students with disabilities. It's also have proof that with people with disabilities. Most professionals support restraints and seclusion emergency situations, it said. However, there is limited research proving that restraints and seclusions have therapeutic use. It also talks about restraints and seclusions put the child or client at risk of injury and emotional distress and do not improve behaviors. It discussed positive behavior intervention support plans and how they can change behaviors and not restraints or seclusion. So that was how they looked at an alternative to restraints in that article. The next two articles, they were both case studies on males. The first one was on deep touch, just to minimize the physical and mechanical restraints. The case study was done on a 31-year-old male with ASD. He presented with physically aggressive behaviors causing him to be restrained, often either with physical or mechanical restraints. After they introduced a deep touch pressure, his restraints were eliminated within a few months. So this showed that his restraints were probably more of a sensory thing, and so it was able to be eliminated through that alternative. And then the last one that I have was the positive alternatives to physical restraint. And this is another case study, as I said. It was also a male, 18 years old, and he was on the spectrum. And in 1 year before alternatives were tried, he was in approximately 180 restraints. So choice support is what they used within this case study, and they worked with him, and they used applied behavior analysis, and they used a multi-element model of assessment, which examined the whole person. So they looked at the background, the family history, medical history, and living environment. And they took all those factors and looked at what was causing the behaviors. And through looking at his whole life and what was affecting his behaviors, they found that actually staffing, because he was in a group home, changing staffing because they were like reinforcing his behaviors, his negative behaviors, his problematic behaviors, it caused him to decrease immensely. So some of the staff were overwhelming him, and there was too many staff, so they decreased staff. His restraints year after they changed staffing and changed things in his life decreased to 14 in a year. And then the year following that, there was 0. So again, it was just looking at his life and what modifications they could make other than using restraint and seclusion. So that's all I had.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the conclusion. And so first of all, I'm just going to talk about how there is a huge overlap between the pros and the cons. Like I said earlier, a lot of the research articles that we found were very blurry about whether they were pro or con. Like one of the articles I had technically was pro, but it was also con because it talked about using the positive reinforcement to get rid of the use of restraints, which is what I am going to assume we all as future behavior analysts want that. We want to not have to put our hands on a client. Like, no one wants to do that. I've had to do it multiple times, and it's not something fun, and it can last for an hour or more, and I would say that we all want to move away from it because it does cause our clients to stick out. And they already have some other things about them that stick out. And so when 3 people are on you because you can't help what you are doing, that just causes more social, more people to not be accepting of you. So some of the biggest overlaps is that both sides do say that it should be done when it's medically necessary. Just the pro says that it's okay to do it as long as it's medically necessary, and the con says it better be medically necessary, and you better have all this proof. And even at that, we should be doing other things to get rid of these restraints. They also just both had same kind of statements. Like the ABAI statement is both pro and con. Like they didn't really give a clear yes, you should use it, or no, you shouldn't use it. It's really just based on your ethical and personal judgments about how you view seclusion and restraints. So even with all this information we've given, you personally still have to take how you feel about it into consideration if you're going to do it or not. There wasn't really a consensus of if it should or should not be done, but it should. If both sides say it should be medically necessary, then it better be medically necessary. So that's how they kind of overlap, and it can be confusing, but.
All right. If it's not allowed in one setting, should it be allowed in others? Is what I'm going to cover. Physical restraints and seclusion there's different laws in pretty much most states of what can and cannot happen. So there's not really a standardized set of rules or laws regarding these. And so it makes it hard for individuals if they move. Laws might be different in one state than another. So should we be using the same thing in one state if another state doesn't agree? Also, sometimes schools can conflict with other programs or just like just an ABA program. They're probably not going to restrain, but at a school they might. So should it be used consistently, or what should that look like? I feel like there should be some kind of standard of, especially state by state, there because many people do move, so that restraints and seclusion are under the same law no matter where you go. And then restraints and seclusion, if they are happening with a child or individual, they should be specified very much what is going to happen and by the case and in their behavior plan or safety plan. But that is what I have.
All right, and the last thing that we were kind of talking about as far as ethics go is what constitutes proper training, because you see that phrase come up a lot in these articles and in the legal text of people need to be properly trained. Much like Mindy pointed out, it varies so drastically between different organizations and different states and different laws and different schools. And each of these organizations comes up with their own definitions and their own accountability systems. And a lot of the breakdown, a lot of the bad press that ABA and restraints and school districts even get stems from that breakdown, where I know California is pretty heavily regulated, and I banned and outlawed the use of restrictions altogether. I would have to double check that something I referred to earlier for the specifics. But in a group where they have completely done away with restriction and seclusion, if someone were to move into that environment and not have the proper training, even though they were properly trained in a different location, it becomes a huge ethical dilemma and a legal issue, unfortunately. So the biggest issue with the definition of proper training is there is no standardized definition. If we were to want to go about making change, that would be the first step we need to do, is uniformly define it across all groups. Federal law, international law, whatever you want to call it. That would be the first place that we need to go to get that taken care of before we could really move forward addressing that particular issue. Within specific organizations, you would have to address that with the organization itself. Just because, as we've already established, it varies so very, very drastically. So to kind of wrap up the whole presentation and debate that we've shared, the use of restriction or restraint is generally accepted as an option. Seclusion is viewed less so. Restraint is allowed, however, it needs to be the last resort. It needs to be done in a well-documented fashion. All parties, particularly guardians or parents, need to be involved and need to have already expressly given permission for it to be used. When instances do occur, they need to be informed immediately, and it needs to be well documented that it has occurred and what occurred in the incident. Restraints and seclusion should never be used as a form of punishment or discipline. Whatever policies are put in place need to be uniform and applied to everyone equally. I believe that pretty much sums up our presentation. So unless there are further comments from my colleagues, we will leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
I'm good.